And board members and Mr. Chambers, as we move through the agenda, I'll read each item, and if there's anything that you'd like for me to stop so that we can have questions or comments, please do that. And Mr. Chambers, I see you have some staff members here, so if there's an occasion where you want to call someone forward, please indicate to me, and then we'll call them up and recognize them and do that process.
Yes, sir.
All right. All right, so board members, as we look at the agenda, I do want to point out there is an agenda change. We don't have these very often, but sometimes we do. We have a visitor, added item 4.1, Sarah Burks, eligibility to participate in middle school extracurricular activities. And then we've added item 9.9, an employee suspension. All right, so in any case, of course, we'll go through the customary routine opening of a call to order, the agenda changes, recognitions, and then moving to section 4, visitors. We again have Ms. Sarah Burks, who is wanting to discuss with us eligibility to participate in middle school extracurricular activities. Now, I would like to ask at this time, Mr. Chambers, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that your district folks have spoken with Ms. Burks, and I see that Mr. Humphreys and Mr. Johnson are here. Have you folks had a chance to meet with our visitor and talk with her?
Yeah. Mrs. Burks has contacted our office and has talked with Mr. Kutsaratis, and I think Sheila spoke to her a couple of times, and we all had the same discussion with her, is that we were following a school board policy in this incident.
Right, and that school board policy is a policy that routinely is recommended by the superintendent, that board members and the attorney, that we act upon, and that board policy is approved. So I would just say that we'll look forward to Ms. Burks being here Monday night. Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. All right, moving on to public comment, 5.1. Members of the public desiring to address the school board. Form MIS 5241, public input. We don't yet know. Section 6, personnel appointments. Appointment of specialist safe schools recommended by the superintendent for approval.
We have a name. I was unable to get that out of my iPad.
There he is.
Are you the safe schools guy, or you just know the answer to that question?
I am not the safe schools guy, but I think.
Yeah, but I think he's in personnel now too.
And I believe the name that will be recommended will be Mr. Dean.
All right.
That's Danny Dean, correct?
Danny Dean.
He's currently, well, he was SRO at Shoal River Middle School. So.
Yes, sir.
And I know that normally, Mr. Chambers, you guys will send us some information, background, and all that kind of stuff that we'll have prior to Monday's meeting. Sometimes, though, we don't get it until Monday because we're still going through the process.
Correct.
That's right.
And
All
that,
right.
that
Yes,
position, Dr. White, is as a result of legislation that was passed.
Thanks for pointing that out. It's a mandate.
Correct.
And they do or do not give us money for this position, the state.
No, sir.
Another unfunded mandate then.
That is correct.
Okay, moving on. All right, item 7, in-county travel paid for the period of June 7/20/2018, presented by Mrs. Scallon. Out-of-county travel paid for the period of June 7th through the 20th, 2018. Moving on to section 8, consent agenda. Approval of the consent agenda. 8.2, approval of the minutes of the special meeting of June 19th, 2018, minutes for the workshop meeting of June 21, 2018, minutes of the regular meeting of June 25th, 2018, recommended by the superintendent for approval. 8.3, appropriation of District 2 School Board Member Capital Outlay Funds to Fort Walton Beach High School for auditorium stage lighting and curtain support in the amount of $10,000, presented by Board Member Dewey Destin and recommended by the superintendent for approval. Item 8.4, appropriation of District 3 School Board Member Capital Outlay Funds to Fort Walton Beach High School for auditorium stage lighting and curtain support in the amount of $12,244, presented by Board Member Rodney Walker and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 8.5, authorization to advertise the proposed preliminary and tentative budget and millage rate for fiscal year 2018-2019, presented by Mrs. Rita Scallon, Chief Financial Officer, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.6, invoices to be approved for payment, presented by Mrs. Rita Scallon, Chief Financial Officer, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.7, school donations, presented by Mrs. Rita Scallon, Chief Financial Officer, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.8, donation of surplus buses from Escambia County School District, presented by Mrs. Rita Scallon, Chief Financial Officer, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.9, letter of engagement between the School Board of Okaloosa County and Carr, Riggs, and Ingram to audit school internal funds for year ended June 30th, 2018, presented by Mrs. Rita Scallon, Chief Financial Officer, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.10, ITB 18-18 fixed price fence bid, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.11, tag on bid renewal RFP 71-1/15 commodity processing food services district-wide, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.12, tag on bid ITB 18,000-DST-VT commodity food processing, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.13, tag on bid purchase over 25,000 Sion, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
And Dr. White?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, again, for the public, I know we've talked at length about the donation from Escambia County that we just passed through, but these purchases will go on those buses, correct, Jay? The cameras and the DVR systems that we're purchasing from Scion will be going on those new to us but used buses.
And they left some of the cameras on the buses. We're just having to put DVRs on some of them, and then we'll have a few brand new systems on some of them. So it's not a total wash, but that's what they're going on. We'll put radios and cameras on all the buses.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. McInnes. Okay, moving on then to 8.14, exempted purchase over 25,000 NWEA, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
And Mr. Chambers,
Yes,
Dr. White, I didn't ask Mr. Chambers or members of his staff, but I mean, parents are not familiar with NWEA, but they're familiar with MAP. And prior to that, we were using a system called DEA, and that's a performance assessment, so we can track kind of at the beginning, middle, and end of the year how students are progressing. And so I know this has been is it our first complete year with MAP this year?
Our first complete year.
And so I didn't know if there's anything that we can share on the differences and the usefulness of this program and how it's, you know, helped us this year or going to help us in subsequent years continue improving our performance.
We can get a more detailed report, but I will say it's for ELA, it's for math, it's for science. It gives us reports back specifically by the standard, but then it goes even deeper than that. It gives you the skills within the standard for each student, and it puts it in a way where you can clump those students together so you can deliver what we call the differentiated instruction for those kids. So there's a lot of excellent reports. There is a tie to the FSA in terms of that reliability, which is good. But the thing that I believe we love most about the new MAP test is it's to the standards of Florida, and it's specific, and it can help teachers drive instruction for those students.
Okay, thank you.
And we really like it, to the tune of $245,000.
But we're required, again, we're mandated to have a way to track performance assessment throughout the year.
Absolutely, and in terms of feasibility, in terms of cost, one, you want to make sure you have a good, strong program, which this is, but it's actually one of the more affordable programs that are out there.
And ostensibly, there appears to be some correlation between MAPS and the FSA based upon our outstanding performance in school grades and our district grade.
Correct.
All right, 8.15, exempted purchase over $25,000, Discovery Education, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.16, exempted purchase over $25,000, Raptor Technologies, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
And Dr. White,
Yes,
I know Eric Mitchell's not here, but again, this is the way we check in visitors and check in and out students who are pulled in and out for various reasons throughout the day from school. And so I know we've had several issues with our previous vendor, and I know towards the end of this past year we did kind of a dual trial where we had both systems working, and I'm just appreciative of all the effort of our office staff, because I know it was a tremendous effort on their behalf to work with both systems and work with Eric and the IT personnel just to make sure that we work out some of the issues. There's no complete perfect system right now able to provide us everything we would like it to have, but I'm hopeful that this system will reduce some of the stress that our office staff, who do a phenomenal job of having visitors on campus and checking in and out students. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thrush. Critical area, very much so. All right, 8.17, exempted purchase over $25,000, achieve $3,000, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.18, service agreement number 19-08, Career Staff Unlimited, LLC, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.19, service agreement number 19-09, Emerald Coast Science Center, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.2, service agreement number 19-10, Emerald Coast Science Center, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.21, service agreement number 19-11, Emerald Coast Science Center, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.22, service agreement number 19-12, Emerald Coast Science Center, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.23, service agreement number 19-13, Emerald Coast Science Center, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.24, service agreement number 19-14, Emerald Coast Science Center, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
Dr. White, I'd like to
Yes, sir.
comment on the previous,
Yep.
the agreements we have with the Emerald Coast Science Center.
Yep.
Diane Frazier and her team over there do an awesome job with our students, and if you've ever had a chance to go to the small lab, it is pretty cool. I mean, it's like a computer right there on the floor and everything, and you kind of, if you saw the movie Big where they were doing the piano thing, you got to go out there with your feet and you play along with the computer out on the floor. But just the things that they have to offer out there. I got to hold a python, a hedgehog. I mean, it's just a really cool place out there, and I'm glad we have this agreement in place with Diane Frazier and the Emerald Coast Science Center.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan, and I've had a long association with Ms. Frazier, and she really is a quality person, just doing great work there. At one time at a school that I worked at, she was the PTO president. And I knew that once she took over that operation that we were going to have some great results.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I would just also like to thank Ms. Ellis, and also just remind people that these are agreements that we have in place, but then it's up to the school to be able to come up with the funds to be able to use these great programs. And it is a tremendous asset to kind of bring the Science Center into our schools. But it's not a dedicated funding source that we have to be able to fund all of these type programs. Am I misspeaking, Tammy? I mean, we use some we have some funds, but not every school can participate in all of these.
Yes, ma'am. These
programs.
are set prices for all schools to use. We do have a DODEA grant that provides our middle school students the ability to attend, but that's all. The rest of the funding comes from the schools.
Each schools.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. 8.25, Service Agreement number 19-15, Julie Henderson, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.26, Service Agreement number 19-16, Christy Woodward, presented by Mr. Vince Wyndham, Program Director Purchasing, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.27, Provider Managed Auction Services Agreement between the School Board of Okaloosa County, Florida, and Bedelia Incorporated, Florida, AB 3574, to provide online auction services for surplus property, presented by Mr. Steve Bolton, Director of Facilities Planning and Maintenance, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.28, renewal of the lease extension agreement between the School Board of Okaloosa County, Florida, and Northwest Florida Visionaires Incorporated, presented by Mr. Steve Bolton, Director of Facilities Planning and Maintenance, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.29, recommendation to surplus and donate 2 spare buses to the Raider Group, presented by Mr. Jay McInnes, Program Director of Transportation, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.30, renewal of joint agreement between the School Board of Okaloosa County and the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office for the continued operation of an educational facility and canine training area on the Okaloosa Technical College and Choice High School campus, presented by Mr. Andy Johnson, Specialist, Student Intervention Services, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
And Dr. White, I was just, again, for the public, I know we've had this agreement previously, but we're not housing canines at that location. It's just a training facility only, but it's a win-win situation for the school district and the sheriff's office. And so I appreciate the efforts of both Sheriff Ashley and his staff and district staff in coordinating this agreement.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, moving on to 8.31, renewal agreement for a school resource officer program between the School Board of Okaloosa County and the Sheriff of Okaloosa County for 2018-2019, presented by Mr. Andy Johnson, Specialist, Student Intervention Services, Safe Schools, Athletics, and Health, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
Got some questions.
All right, Mr. Destin. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Chambers, would you like Mr. Johnson to come up?
Please.
Come on up, Mr. Johnson.
Sir.
It appears that we have a substantial price increase in the 20 to 22% range, at least that's what I could tell as I read the document. I know we've added a couple of officers at several of the high schools, but that doesn't come up to the 22%. And what reason?
Sure.
And for Rita, where does that money come from out of the budget?
Well, exactly. Ms. Scallons be the better person to speak to it, but the district is assuming a greater portion. It has to do with some of the funding that we're receiving.
And we are going to receive some. That's a good note.
Okay. What's in the past, the total contract, we paid a third of it, about 33%. and the Sheriff's Department funded
The rest of
the
it.
67%
Yep.
from local funds and also some grant funds. So with the last legislative session, and we know what happened down in South Florida, and some of the legislation that they passed and directing us to do certain things in the safety area, in the mental health area, we did receive an increase in Safe Schools allocation, and so it was approximately an increase of $1.1 million. And so the legislation specifically said that that money would first be used to add additional officers. And so what has happened is, and I'm going to explain it, I know it's going to sound convoluted, but in order to comply with that legislation, there are 11 officers that are being added from what we had this past year. So we had 43 officers, and that's including supervisors. So for 18-19, we will have 54 officers. 11 of those we will pay 100%. The other 43, we will our increase will go from about 33% to actually about 38%, so it's about a 5% increase on what we were already paying. The 22 that's reflected on there is in total the cost percentage increase. So we will be paying 100% for 11 officers out of the Safe School allocation increase, categorical restricted money, and then we will continue to fund the 43 officers, but our percentage will move from about 33% to about 38%, which is about a 5% increase. And as in previous years, we will use our original Safe School allocation amount to go towards that contract, and then we're using about $650,000 out of reserves to fund that.
But I think there's some good news there in the sense that I believe your office or other folks worked with I guess the Department of Education for some clarification on how those dollars could be spent. Would you talk about that just
Yes,
a moment?
we had, I had some concerns because of the legislation and how we could use that. We had a meeting with the Sheriff's Department and with Mr. Ashley, and he actually was the one that pursued getting clarification from the governor, from the Commissioner of Education, from DOE, and we finally did receive a letter after he
Good.
made
It's in
numerous
writing.
attempts.
It's in writing.
Yes, that the 6 that we had hired temporarily last year for a couple of months after the incident down in South Florida, that we could count those to use this increased allocation towards to make them permanent.
So 6 of the 11 essentially are the 6 that we added in the late spring. But just to clarify for the public, the way the legislation was written, you could only use it for new hires, and essentially we were one of very few districts, 2 districts that already had SROs at all of their schools. So in
Exactly.
effect, we didn't want to be penalized. But as you stated, we're still having to use $672,000 of reserve funds. In previous years, we've been having to use reserve funds, I think, around
Yes.
over $800,000. So while I appreciate the increase in funds, it's still not enough. And again, we're very fortunate that Sheriff Ashley in the county's budget for his department enables him to cover that, anywhere from 60 to 66% difference. If that funding goes away, then we will have to come up with either more reserves or
Cuts.
cuts, correct.
Ms. Scanlon, the reserves are not a reoccurring
No.
resource.
No, anytime you use reserves, that's a non-recurring source of revenue that you're pledging to a recurring expenditure.
That's right. So eventually, that's going to bite us.
Eventually, it can bite you, yes.
Unless we are able
Unless
to
we get an
continue to
increase.
add reserves, right?
Either add reserves, and of course, that's difficult when you only receive 47 cents per student in new funding, or there's an increase in a categorical allocation that would help us.
And we had some, but not enough.
No.
Or cuts.
No, we did not have, I mean, we had that increase.
Okay, you're
but
talking about
it-
the regular categorical, I
Yeah,
understand.
yes,
Okay,
schools.
so that's not something we can rely on at all.
No.
Okay.
Next year, it's a new year.
That's right, and past performance indicates to us that that most likely is not going to get better. So my question is, what's our plan if we continue to pull out of reserves and because of the lack of categoricals can't put back in reserves? That's a dead-end street eventually.
Eventually.
Do we have any plans on how we're going to address that dilemma?
Well, the only two ways that I would know to address that dilemma is that you would either have to make cuts somewhere else in the budget to support continuing the SRO program, or you would have to reduce the SRO program.
Yeah.
I mean, those are really your only two options based on what you just said, that the forecast of receiving an increase in revenue is probably slim.
And that's the exact conclusion I came to, and we're headed toward the budget process. So it looks to me like we're going to have to figure out some ways to put something in place so that we can fund this program permanently or discontinue it, and I don't think that's an option. So, you know, just fellow board members, we need to keep that in mind as we go into the process here shortly.
And I appreciate that remark very much, Mr. Destin, and I'll just say that in my opinion, as one board member, right off the bat, school safety has to be number one.
Yep, I would agree.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate you working on that. I know it was a big change, and the lawyer and Ms. Gallen and everybody else and the sheriff too. All right, thank you. All right, 8.32, contract between the School Board of Okaloosa County and AMI Kids Emerald Coast Incorporated, presented by Mr. Andy Johnson, Specialist Student Intervention Services, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 8.33, contract between the School Board of Okaloosa County and Northwest Florida Ballet Incorporated for the 2018-2019 school year, presented by Mr. Jeff Palmer, Director of 1 Elementary Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
And again, Dr. White, just a unique public school. I think sometimes that's a myth that the Ballet Academy is a charter school, but that's a Okaloosa County public school and a great opportunity for our students 3rd through 8th grade to experience their athleticism in ballet, also while performing extremely well academically.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Rush. All right, 8.34, Carl D. Perkins Secondary Entitlement Grant for fiscal year 2018-2019, presented by Ms. April Branscombe, Specialist Career and Technical Education, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
Dr. White, I mean, I didn't talk to April prior to the workshop, but are we adding welding at Baker with the Carl Perkins grant? I didn't remember us having that CTE program, or am I remiss in realizing that we were doing welding up at Baker?
We currently have welding at Baker, but we're actually going to fund it for the next 3 years. We're phasing it out and replacing it with carpentry or construction.
Okay. And again, this is the grant that allows us to buy much needed equipment for our various career technical programs.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think right now at Baker, if I'm not, I was there last year, but their carpentry class and their welding class are all one. So
Yes.
they have to like shut down carpentry a little early to clean up so they can do welding the next class. So
Exactly.
this is going to help them be able to.
Yes. So we have a middle school carpentry program, and we're going to just bring it into the high school level.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Branson. Thank you, Mr. Rush. All right, 8.35, Independent Contractor Service Agreement between Matthew Pellegrino and the School Board of Okaloosa County for investigative services rendered during the term of the contract, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
I had one question.
Sure.
I noticed that a section was put in that said, in questions of which work product are exempt from public records law, that Mr. Pellegrino would consult with Mr. Mitchell. And that's pretty intense legal opinion, and I think it'd be more appropriate that he's directed to consult with the school board attorney.
And Mr. McInnes, I think you may have looked at this contract. That may be a change that you could
We
make.
can make that change. The provision that's there under Section K is that's the standard provision that we added a couple of years ago when the statute required us to give notice to all vendors of who they could contact in the district with public records issues. Obviously, Mr. Mitchell reaches out to me if he has a question, but we can revise that if you'd like to revise it.
If you would, I would appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Destin. Anything else, board members, on that one?
Yeah, well, and I would just add, you know, since personnel changes, not that I'm expecting a personnel change, but do we normally list individuals by name in agreements, or would we just list the custodian of public records?
My memory, Ms. Thrush, is that when we prepared this, it was because we had to provide this information
Okay.
to folks to contact. So
Based
that's
on the
why it's
legislation.
done that way.
Okay.
And we talked about this, and I know the answer. Mr. Pellegrino will be following the new procedures, the new investigative procedures that the school district has come up with. And so Mr. Chambers is acknowledging that that is, of course, the case, board members.
And Mr. Chairman, if you will look under Section 1, that actually has been added to the agreement. There is a line added to scope of work that confirms that he will be following that.
Yeah, I wondered how that got there. That's right. All right, Superintendent's Human Resources recommendation, 9.1. Deferred Retirement Option Program drop, presented by Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 9.2, cleared certification requirements and issuance of contracts for the 2018-2019 school year, presented by Ms. Karen Peak, Program Director of Professional Services, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 9.3, request to double fill the position of teacher, Plough Elementary School, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval.
Mr. Chambers, can you explain that? I've seen double fill on principals. I don't recall one on a teacher.
So unfortunately, at Plough, we have a teacher who is ill and will be out all year. So instead of having a substitute be in place all year for those students, requesting the opportunity for us to double fill that position for the sake of those students.
Is that the way we do it traditionally if a teacher's going to be sick? I mean, we don't have any built-in system. I know that over the career of my wife, a number of teachers became ill, and we somehow addressed it without double fill. There's nothing in the system that works for that, huh?
So the system would be a sub, a long-term sub. So that's how you would go ahead and address that.
And if I could just offer, one of the problems with that would be the rate of pay. And then that individual, they may get employed in another regular position, and so we go through a litany of replacements for that classroom, and that's probably not the place we want to be. And I agree, it was unusual when I saw it. And sometimes employees have extensive amounts of leave, and so I couldn't think of any other way.
That explanation works for me.
Okay, yes, sir.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Destin. Thank you, Mr. Chambers. Okay, 9.4, personnel recommendations presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the Superintendent for approval. 9.5, employment separations, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 9.6, employee transfers, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 9.7, reinstatement reimbursement of sick leave due to line of duty illness, injury, medical examination, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 9.8, leave without pay, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 9.9, employee suspension, presented by Mr. Marcus Chambers, Assistant Superintendent, Curriculum and Instruction, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. All right, discussion items, we don't have any yet. Section 11, construction program owners representatives business, we'll hold that for Monday. No items in section 12. Before we get to our attorney's business, let's go ahead and slide down, board members, and take a look at the public hearings. There are a myriad of those. 16.1, public hearing for adoption of revised school board policy 01-21 wellness policy, presented by Ms. Lisa Sunday, Insurance Ombudsman and Risk Management, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.2, public hearing for adoption of a new job description for mental health counselor, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.3, public hearing for the adoption of a new job description for roving cleaner, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.4, public hearing for the adoption of a revised job description for a custodial zone manager, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.5, public hearing for adoption of a revised job description for lead custodian, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.6, public hearing for adoption of a revised job description for school custodian hourly, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.7, public hearing for adoption of a revised job description for school custodian 2, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.8, public hearing for adoption of a revised job description for school custodian 2, day custodian, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. 16.9, public hearing for adoption of a revised job description for cleaner, presented by Mrs. Lindsay Maxey, Specialist, Human Resources, and recommended by the superintendent for approval. Phew. All right, let's go back.
One question, Chairman.
Yes, sir. Okay, go ahead. Yes, sir.
I guess we've all been briefed on the plan to reconstitute or remodel our maintenance, and I only take it for granted that all of these descriptions are part of that plan? Yes, sir. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Destin. All right, Mr. McGinnis, your turn.
No report today.
Okay. Superintendent.
Yes, I was privileged to spend time with our friends in Destin this morning. A very good meeting with some of them. A lot of good questions, and I really enjoyed that time with them this morning, and that's why I was a little late. Secondly, for 5 years, I won't call it someone has been hounding me, but I would say someone has been encouraging me to look at the 4 10-hour days. Bay County has been doing this for 20 years, Escambia 7, Walton I think 2 years, and they are convinced that it is a good thing. It's a good thing for employees. It's a good thing in that they have been able to save a little money, not a tremendous amount, but a little money. The jury's still out on that. I don't know. So for the next 3 weeks, We will be piloting this program in our schools. We worked with principals, department heads, staff, senior staff, everyone we can think of, and they want to try this. So Mr. Johnson will be doing a call-out message today. He and I talked over the weekend, and not the weekend, this feels like Monday, but he and I talked over the holiday, and he's going to be doing that call-out just to let all the parents know that it will be changing a little bit. Some of the feedback that I received this morning from some folks in Destin is, hey, great, the schools will be open later so I can leave work and get over to the school. And I said, that's right, I hadn't thought about that, because a lot of them have to leave their job in the middle of the day to get there to get things done. So we'll see. We'll see. We're going to look at things like employee attendance. We're going to look at things like utility savings, and we're going to do an analysis of that and see if indeed this is a good move. So I'm a little nervous about it, but I think we're going to try it, because I think maybe it could be potentially a really good thing for our district. And that's all I have to say.
Yes, ma'am, and along those lines, I know that Mr. Johnson to call out, and you'll make this publicly available frequently, because occasionally I remember long ago that I'm not sure what days of the week we're looking at, probably
Monday through Thursday.
Okay. Well, I think that's what we did too.
And just the summer period.
Yes,
just
ma'am.
these
Yes,
3
ma'am.
weeks.
Right. And but I well remember that on Fridays, sometimes folks would show up to register their children for school. And I know that we'll have something in place to let them know at the school when they show up there, because they might not get the call out because they're not students.
Absolutely,
And,
absolutely.
They'll be aware that to come back on another day.
There was one other thing, Mr. Chairman. By order of the state, we have to have signs up in all of our schools that say, "In God We Trust." Mr. Bolton and I have already been working on that and getting someone to look at doing that for us and getting that in every school. I'm assuming we will want something here as well.
Absolutely.
And so Mr. Bolton and his staff are already working on taking care of that for us.
Very good. Thank you, Superintendent. And we've kind of had something here all along, because over there on the wall we have the state seal. But that's not exactly what the state's talking about. And so I know that we're excited to, at least I am, to do what they're talking about.
Well,
Okay.
I just wanted
Yes,
to
sir.
comment real quick on the call out, and you did say that, you know, we have to be clear, because then you'll
Yes.
get some people thinking, oh, we're only have 4 days school, you know. So we want to make sure we get that clear. It's just for
But this is just for office.
Right.
And schools.
Schools.
There'll be a lot of people
for the-
excited about that.
For the summer.
Correct. There will be some things, and I shared those with all of you in emails, some specifics that we already know we're going to have to work with, this will give us a chance to see the bumps and the hiccups. And if it's, I didn't want to just go all out without testing it first. So
Is it possible that we'll be, putting something on the district webpage or
Absolutely,
Facebook
yes,
feed? Since,
yes.
some
Yes.
people, as Dr. White alluded to, are not existing parents yet. They're new to
Correct.
the area.
Correct.
Okay.
And so the proposal is perhaps to do this during the regular school year also?
Oh, no.
Okay.
This would only be during the summer.
Okay.
I know there's a lot of research out there that is suggesting that a 4-day school week is good for students. And I'm not there yet. I just got here. And in the last 2 or 3 months, I've really seriously considered trying this for staff. I think there may be a savings. The other piece that was brought to my attention is when we need to do something big in a school, we can now schedule people to come in on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday and work the weekend and not have to displace everybody out of a school if they're working on something that our employees don't need to be around. So we'll see. I will have a full report with some data for you at the end of this 3 weeks. It will be from July 9 to July 27.
All right, thank you, Madam Superintendent. All right, if there's anything else, let's go on to board members' business. And Mr. Bryant, sir, I'll start with you today.
Well, I mean, some great news. We are an A district. That's pretty awesome.
Amen.
So, and I do want to congratulate all the schools that were A, but I do have to say a special shout out to Laurel Hill
Oh, my goodness, yes.
and to Wright Elementary.
Yes.
Both of them went from C's to A's.
Yes.
And, you know, I just think all of our schools are awesome. So whether
Yes.
they're A, B, or C, you know, I'm proud of all of our schools and
Yes.
everybody that has worked hard to get to where we're at. But to be one of 3 districts to be a school for all the time that they've been grading it, to me, that's a huge accomplishment, and I'm really proud of our district.
Yes. It's very hard to stay at the top.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bryant. Ms. Roche?
I just have ditto, so I don't really have much to add, but extremely proud of all of our staff and students and the effort of district level staff. It definitely takes a village.
That's right. Mr. Destin?
I don't think I have anything this morning, but I concur with my other fellow board members. To be A is consistently again and again and again is a pretty major accomplishment. So,
Yes.
Yeah, the word's dedication.
yeah.
I mean, that's how I see it. But okay, so unless there's, well, how about staff? Anything from staff that we didn't cover? All right, unless there's anything else, Superintendent, Mr. McGinnis? Board members? We're good? Adjourned.
Okay.